Hi, I'm Tova Sherman, host of Inclusion Revolution, where we can make a difference in 30 minutes. Just stick around, I'll show you how. Hi, I'm Tova Sherman, host of Inclusion Revolution, welcoming you to another week of information that is relevant to equalizing the playing field for our entire community. Today, as part two of our two-part series on employers, and again focusing on viewer mail and issues that have been brought up by our viewers, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to talk about your disability, not only to an employer but to everyone. So we're calling this issue disclosure, and disclosure means just that, talking about something you wouldn't otherwise necessarily talk about or choose to. And I know that not only the viewers, but everyone that I work with in the disability community, one of the great challenges faced is, can I disclose at an interview? Should I? When should I? And of course, how? So our viewer letter today was just that, and I'm going to read that as part of our lead into our discussion. A viewer wrote me, I have a disability, and I'm scared to tell my boss. She doesn't know yet. It's not physical. Should I let her know, or do I keep it a secret? Signed, RH. And that seems to be a sentiment I hear, again, not only for people applying for jobs, but also from the employers themselves on how do I deal with it, how do I ask about it. So I wanted to share with you a couple of the basic steps. And then in our second segment, we're also going to have a guest on to talk a little bit about some of the experiences in disclosure around interviewing and some of the misnomers, and we're going to correct some of those myths. And as always, in this new season of Inclusion Revolution, in our third segment, we will be bringing you health news, great healthy recipes, as well as other information. So you'll be wanting to stick around for that as well. But let's get started on the issue of disclosure. There's a couple of things you really need to ask yourself first. First of all, let's talk about the definition, so we're all on the same page. What is disclosure? And if you check out this slide, you'll see. Disclosure means the giving out of information, which might commonly be kept secret, usually voluntarily, or perhaps to be in compliance with legal regulations or workplace rules. Disclosure to potential employers is really letting people know about your disability. And that makes a lot of sense to all of us, because we all have a concern about saying when something isn't necessarily the way others believe it should be. In our last episode, we had a very touching conversation with Lisa Schaefer, who had faced a lot of barriers in talking about her disability and having people understand and work with her, both as an employer and as an employee. And today we're going to carry that on with some really strong ideas on disclosure itself. First thing I want you to know is that you've got to disclose if it's going to affect the job. Let me explain this. We have a little slide. You have an employer. This is called my choices slide. You see the employer, and you have two choices. On the upper hand, you see you can disclose, and one of two things will happen. You will be prepared to disclose because you'll be able to talk about it and do it right, and that employer will ultimately be an employer of choice, meaning they're going to be someone who understands what you're saying because you've said it in a way they understand. Secondly, you can also choose not to disclose. And ultimately, as our little slide shows, that means we just cross our fingers and we hope there aren't any issues. And frankly, that generally doesn't work. The truth is, you're in charge on the discussion of disclosure. I can't tell you when to do it or when not to do it, nor would I dare. But what I will ask you is to consider the following things when deciding to disclose. And as I mentioned, number one is, how will it affect the job? You must review the list of job description and ensure that your disability is not in any way going to affect your capacity to fulfill those responsibilities. Now, if you've reviewed that list and you require no accommodation, and in fact can go so far as to say it really doesn't even relate to my disability, for instance, the fact that I have arthritis in my neck isn't something I need to disclose when I'm doing Inclusion Revolution, because it's not relevant. I'm okay. I'm not sitting there staring with my neck stiff for 12 hours. So in that case, there's no need to disclose. But usually we find that we do need some form of accommodation in the workplace. And that's where the work begins on disclosure, not when you're in the employer's office. Here's what I mean. Ask yourself the question, if I can't go through this list and identify that I require no accommodation, then I need to figure out when and how to bring that disability up. I always recommend that we do not discuss our disability in either our cover letter or our resume, because oftentimes, unfortunately, in this world that is not perfect, where everyone is not educated in inclusion and understanding persons with disabilities as part of equalizing the playing field for a healthy community. Not every employer thinks that, and as a result, we have to be aware of where our disability might be affecting our ability to do that job and what accommodations might be required. We cannot expect the employer to know. So to bring it up, and when we're putting our first step forward, either as a cover letter or in the resume, often will, as I say, move us to the shred. Employers are taught to screen out. And although in today's world, smart employers are screening in, meaning including as many people as possible in the interview process in order to create a diverse employment environment. That's ideal, but that's not always the case. So when they're screening out, we need to realize that's part of that process. And we certainly don't want to put a foot forward that will in any way create prejudgments as to our capacity. So again, if it is just sending in the resume, I see no reason to discuss your disability, because unless you've reviewed that job and it says must be able to climb ladders and you use a wheelchair, in which case you shouldn't be applying for that job anyway. Let's remember that. Apply for jobs that you won't be setting yourself up for. That's the first thing. So back to the disclosure piece. We now know that we've sent in a resume, and I'm not surprised at all to find out that your resume was good. It said some of the things the employer needed, and now you've been invited for an interview. At this point, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. Do I require accommodation at the interview? Although when I train employers, I always tell them to ask anyone coming in for an interview if they require accommodation, the truth is most don't. And as a result, if you do require, for instance, you're a person who uses a wheelchair and the building where you're going to be going is not accessible and it's all stairs up to the office, that's going to be a challenge for you, and you're going to have to let that employer know ahead of time that you do require access and what you require in order to meet with them and talk about all your many, many skills and attributes. That is the only reason I tend to bring up a disability before the interview, if in fact the interview environment needs some accommodation. If not, I'm still putting my best foot forward. I'm not identifying things which could get me screened out, especially in an environment where people are not trained in disability awareness, and that's really important. So now what? Well, we're heading for the interview. We are heading for the interview, but before we get into that, and I'm going to bring in our guest, Leah Watson, to talk about that interview process, I also wanted to let you know that we got another little tiny viewer mail that we're going to address when we come back from our interview, and that is the question, when is the best time to let employers know about my disability during the interview? We're going to be addressing that question when we come back, but first, take a look at part 2 of our Employer of Choice video. I think you're going to find it really fascinating. We'll be right back.
You have to start somewhere, and this is the start.
You're laying the foundation.
Starting the culture of inclusivity.
Getting rid of the culture of fear.
Building a stronger company.
You need to get rid of barriers within your company.
Physical and attitudinal. It's called universal access.
It starts with training.
Top on down.
If you want it to work, you need everybody on board.
How to talk about disabilities.
Having an open door policy on disabilities.
It's a big point for your current staff if they know
that they can come to you about their disability.
And be treated fairly before you hire anyone with a disability.
It's not about special treatment, it's about equal treatment for everyone.
If you can get into the building,
shouldn't everyone be able to?
Did I mention training?
Ongoing.
How? Reachability.
Call them.
You have to put a policy in place for persons living with disability.
Talk to a disability specialist.
No matter how small your company is, you can still benefit from this process.
It's about assessing needs, my needs.
Knowing that it's about the right person for the right job.
It's more than the token hire in the warehouse.
Think different. Think big.
You're missing out if you don't.
Cost?
Our costs were $25, the cost of a lamp. with a brighter light.
It was changing the font size on the training manual.
It was 3 5-minute breaks rather than 1 15.
It was about saving thousands on training over 5 years because our staff turnover was less.
We're a business. If it didn't make financial sense, we wouldn't do it.
Since the year 2000, Reachability Association has provided innovative and effective educational, recreational, and employment programs, along with a legal referral service, all at no cost to our clients. Visit reachability.org for more information.
Would you like to be an employer of choice by bringing diverse employees to your workplace? Improve work quality and productivity? Visit IDEA or Independent Disability Education Associates at disabilityeducation.ca to find out more.
Welcome back to Inclusion Revolution. And when we broke, I was just reading some additional viewer mail around the issue of disclosure. And just to remind you, that question was, when is the best time to let employers know about my disability during an interview? And as we were just touching on that before we broke, I just wanted to wrap that up before I introduce our guest, Leah Watson, and say we've got to disclose when we've shown our best foot. Ideally, when someone asks us, is there anything else I need to know, or is there anything you want me to know? And then we're down to the how. And let me say one more time, how is crucial. We must understand our disability. We must understand what accommodation we need. We can't expect the employer to be a psychic. And I really think that's really important, to own your information and bring it up at the end when it's appropriate to bring it up. You know what I mean. Sell you first and all the things that are the best. And I can't think of someone who sells herself better and has a better amount of skills to bring than Reachability's own legal coordinator, Leah Watson. Thank you so much for joining us today, Leah. I was really interested in having you on today because you had expressed to me some of the challenge you yourself had faced as a person living with disability in really looking for a job. I mean, you are in fact a social worker with a degree, coming out with wonderful skills. And when I first met you, as I recall, one of the things we had talked about was the challenges when you disclose to employers that you have a hearing impairment, which would seem certainly to someone like me, who has a whole dictionary of things, quite benign in terms of it being a concern.
Yes.
But yet you identified to me that it really seemed to be a barrier for employment.
Yes,
Can you share with me some of your experiences?
Well, I graduated in May and I started looking for jobs, and I was mostly looking at government. And when I first started,
Can I ask you why government? Because I think I know the answer, but I'd like our viewers to know.
There's a lot of social workers in the government working for income assistance, persons with disabilities. And I did my placement there at Persons with Disabilities, so I had a really good experience, and I wanted to continue. And just because everybody has gotten a job through there as well. So
when you say everybody, a lot of
my co-workers that I used to work with, as well as classmates, and in the government, well, the provincial government, they have employment equity program. So when you apply, you can say your disability.
In fact, you encourage that, don't you, Lee, in the case of government? I know you had mentioned that because they are so forthcoming, not only in stating they're looking, but also, as you mentioned, the Employment Equity Act, which does specifically identify not only government, but those that work with government have certain regulations around hiring of minorities or what we call, major groups of concerns, such as persons with disabilities. So that made you very confident that that would be a good place to go.
Yes, so I've been doing that for a few months, and in each cover letter that we had to write a cover letter for these jobs. And in each one, I would mention my disability. I wouldn't say what disability I had, but I mentioned that I have a disability. This is why I think I'd be a great team player in this organization, and I would state everything.
Can I ask you again why? Because I know I just finished telling our viewers, ideally not to put it in a cover letter, but the exception, and as you've identified, is really with government because they seem very much more open and interested in that diverse population.
Yes, and I do with the government because I don't want to lie about my disability. I'm comfortable with it, and I want people to see that.
And I also need to say, though, for those, it's not lying by not disclosing it at the front end. I just need to clarify that more for our viewers. I know for you, it's something you like to talk about it as such an advantage in diversity that it would be something to bring up. But I do want to say clearly to all of our viewers, for those of those, concerned about that, I don't recommend it as a whole, but in your case, I understand exactly why you did it. And because, quite frankly, hearing impairment, you would think, wouldn't be such a barrier to people as well. So it's fascinating, but I do want to clarify that for everyone. So you chose that.
Yes. But anything that's outside the government, I wouldn't mention my disability until I go into the interview. And then I would get a feeling of who that person was and if I should say, because really, like, I don't need any combinations.
Right.
Like, I can use the phone okay, so I didn't feel like, okay, well, maybe I should mention what kind of combinations I do.
So in your case, you really didn't require any accommodation at the job, so one could argue, certainly based on my thinking, it really didn't need to come up, but you chose to do so because you felt it could be a benefit, not by any stretch a hindrance, and it's not a hindrance to you.
Yes.
Okay.
I felt it could be a benefit for me to be able to get a job because they might see more uniqueness in me and
the diversity you bring. Absolutely.
So that's what
so
I
how'd it go?
Months and months of unemployment and a struggle to get a job, and then, you know, trying to figure out, well, should I say that I have a disability? Should I say I don't? Where to go? So it was, and every place is different. And
that's really the point, isn't it? You never know who you're facing or what experience or what their experience is with disability.
Yeah, and it's really hard when you say I have a disability because some people have a certain stigma to that. And so when I say, oh, I am hard of hearing, then they might say, well, then she won't be able to use a phone or...
The assumptions begin.
Yes.
How do we change that? I mean, we talked in our last episode a little bit about grassroots work, and we've been watching some of the pieces of the video of the Employer of Choice video series that was developed by Reachability Nova Scotia. And that's great, you know, to get some information out there. But your experience is so classic. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, do you find that when you have a hearing impairment, people assume other disabilities exist? Or have you experienced that?
Yes, I do.
If you have a hearing impairment, what else is wrong is what I used to hear a lot from clients. And I wonder if you experience that.
Yes and no.
Okay.
It depends on what agency I'm applying for, and again on that person and their personal experience that they might have, either with working with the person with the disability or a family member. There are times where people say, is there anything else that we should know? And I said, I'm fine.
Yeah. Sometimes because really it isn't, well, it isn't going to affect your work. And again, I don't recommend discussing it if it doesn't, because unfortunately, although the diversity is valued by most of us, oftentimes those that are not provided that foundation of knowledge I always talk about, it's very hard for them to understand it, and they're more interested in seeing the shredder when they hear the word disability than perhaps the diversity side of it.
Yes.
And although we're all trying to work on that, I think individually the area of disclosure is probably one of the most challenging areas, and that's why I wanted you to share not only some of your positive experiences, but some of the realities you face, so that our viewers can really get a sense of that it's, first of all, not just them.
Yes.
You know? So tell me, what were some of those experiences? Because you got interviews. Was it the resume wasn't getting responded to when you mentioned the disability, or were you getting into the interviews?
I was getting into the interviews, and the interviews were all fine, but with government it was harder because everything was based on the score. So that was different. So maybe I might give an example of agencies. A lot of the agencies I will mention that I'm hard of hearing, if I actually have to mention a question one more time or get you to repeat something, it's just I didn't get the question, or I just want to make sure I answer it well. And over time I've learned maybe not to use my hearing, just kind of say, do you mind answering that one more time? I want to make sure I answer that question as best as I can.
Rather than I didn't totally hear it.
So eventually I've kind of, and people were interested, and then, but you know, there's always other applicants out there.
Understood. But did you, what's interesting to me is the decision to do that, because the reality of the world that we're in is that sometimes it's better just to say, could you repeat that? Then I live with a hearing impairment.
Yes.
And in your case, I mean, you do wear a hearing aid, and if somebody really wanted to notice, they could.
Yeah.
But I think it's sort of sad state of affairs, quite frankly, that we have to sort of pretend something else is going on. And I do that sometimes too, because I have some of my own disability issues, and you start to fall back onto those habits of a little bit of self-shame, because you know they're not going to respond to it well. Share with me what it does, do you think, for the psyche of people who are so highly intelligent, has so much to offer, but continually feel like they're being judged on something that is so not who they are.
Yeah. Well, I think one important thing, it's so hard nowadays when you're looking for jobs and when you're going in for interviews, a lot of them are pre-screening. So they're through phone or they're through emails or on the internet, and they don't get to see me or the other person that's behind that resume. And I feel like that they can't meet that real person. Like I am normal. Like just look at me, get to know me. And I feel that that's a big disadvantage with people with a disability.
Right. Well, first of all, I think you're better than normal, and I think most people are better than normal. I think the truth be told, we're all very unique.
Yes.
And our abilities and our disabilities are merely attributes and part of us, and they certainly don't define us. You are Leah Watson, lovely, wonderful young lady, not Leah Watson with a disability. And I thank you for being with us. And when we return here on Inclusion Revolution, we're going to do we're going to talk about this week's news, our healthy recipe of the week, and a little bit more about disclosure and employment. We'll see you in just a moment. Welcome back to the show, and I want to thank Leah Watson again for joining us for a brief discussion on some of the realities of talking to employers when you live with disabilities, even disabilities that don't seem to be that dramatic in the scheme of things. Now, as part of Inclusion Revolution's new season, we're going to be moving into this segment where we talk about the news of the week, interesting information that we believe is relevant to you and to yours. Also, we're going to do our healthy recipe of the week coming up. And I just wanted to wrap up our discussion today on disclosure by encouraging anyone interested in more information on disclosure. As employers, we do a module on disclosure, and even for clients, if you're an agency or a client interested in more information, just contact reachability.org or dial 429-5878 here in Halifax, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions or put you on to someone who can. Let's get to this week's news. If you notice on the slide, our news this week is all about recovering speech through song. The fact is that stroke patients who've lost their speech can be taught to speak again by singing, reports the Wall Street Journal. In fact, strokes can damage parts of the brain's left hemisphere that enables us to speak, but neurologists at Harvard have found a way to rewire stroke victims' brains and teaching them to sing what they want to say. Singing not only engages the brain's right hemisphere instead of the left, but by employing this technique, which is called melodic intonation therapy, the team is able to train non-speaking patients to put their words to rhythms and melodies while monitoring their brain activity through an imaging device. In a matter of minutes, one patient who for years has only been able to grunt was actually able to sing a song voice, "I am thirsty." Or as it sounded to him, something like, "I am thirsty." Over several months, the patient learned to convert their sing-song talking into normal speech. The therapy has the potential to help over 60,000 patients in the U.S. alone who've been left speechless by stroke every year. Fascinating stuff going on out there, and we all need to keep our thumb on the pulse of medical breakthroughs, not just as they relate to the disabilities that we and the people that we know may be experiencing, but for the entire community. Knowledge is power, and that's something that Reachability and Inclusion Revolution is all about, providing you the knowledge and ultimately giving you the power to make a difference. Now, in order to make a difference, you're going to have to keep your energy up, so I definitely want to give you this week's recipe. What we've been trying to do is identify recipes that are healthy, not just for everybody, but also for persons with different types of disabilities and different types of challenges they face. For instance, this week, our recipe of the day, or really it's the week, is the nut-free trail mix. Here's the recipe up on the screen. First of all, it's important to know that 1 in 13 Canadians suffer from a food allergy, and peanut and tree nut allergies are the most severe, some of the most severe. So here's our ingredients for a nut-free trail mix. It's healthy, and most importantly for some of us, it's nut-free. 2 parts sunflower seeds or roasted pumpkin seeds. I like the unsalted, but if you're a salt lover, you can throw a little salt in there. 2 parts raisins and 2 parts nut-free granola. That's where we have to watch it. And of course, 2 parts dried fruit. There can be apricots, cherries, dates. I love dried blueberries here in Nova Scotia. And 1 part nut-free chocolate chips if you're a chocolate lover. Adds a little bit of sweetness. Simply combine all the ingredients, put them in an airtight container, give them a good shake. And that comes to us courtesy of our friends at peanutallergy.com. So try that out. It's a very healthy recipe and a great snack to replace things like chips and other things that I know I might have a little bit of an addiction to myself. Now, as always, our shows are directed to and driven by our viewers. And with that in mind, I've promised you that every episode this season will be reflecting that, and our next episode will be no different. We're very pleased to complete this first 2 episodes on employer issues, whether both educating employers as well as issues around disclosure. And again, if you require more information on that, check out reachability.org website or go to the inclusionrevolution.com website. You can also write us your inquiries at info, at inclusionrevolution.com. If you have any questions, we're always happy to answer them. So let's see what next week's going to be about, shall we? Well, I think it's probably one of the most personal issues for me, because a person who lives with ADHD, I was happy to see a letter, and it wasn't from me, I promise, that said, "Dear Tova, my child was just diagnosed with ADHD. We share a lot of the same characteristics. Is there such a thing as adults living with ADHD? Signed, WF." Not only will I be answering that question on the next show, but I'll be giving you a big hint. I live with ADHD, which is really a spectrum of disorders called ADHD spectrum. And next week, we're going to talk about adult ADHD, what it means, what the latest studies are, and how to address that. Until then, this is Tova Sherman for Inclusion Revolution saying you can make a difference. Just stick around and we'll show you how.